Is a short video just to show you how to get started with GeoGebra. So the first thing you would do to use GeoGebra is go to geogebra.org, and we're going to want to download GeoGebra. So this is the home page for GeoGebra. This is what you would see. So what we want to do is we want to download it. So you could either go here and download it, or I'm just going to click up here, and it'll bring us to the downloads page. All right, and there's a lot of options for downloading it. Graphing calculator, geometry calculator, 3D calculator, but what we're going to want is this math calculators, because that basically gives us all three of those tools in one. There's also what's called the GeoGebra Classic, but I think that this is probably simpler to use, and there's a lot more platforms that you can use this with. So for example, if you don't have access to a desktop or a laptop, but you have a tablet, then you could use one of these downloads. I'm on a Mac, that's why this is highlighted, but if I was on a Windows machine, I would want to use Windows. I would avoid the Chrome app, only because it doesn't have the same functionality. It doesn't look exactly the same. One of the reasons I want to go over which one to download is because the instructions that I'll use are relative to which version you're using, right? So if we all use math calculators, then as I go through and explain how to use it, then it's going to look like what you're going to be using. If you were to download something different, then my instructions might not be exactly the same. Lots of options here. So if you have an iPad or an iPhone, you could download from here. If you have an Android device, you could use this. If you have a Windows device, you could use this. Otherwise, I'd recommend using a laptop or a desktop if you have one. Okay, well, I already have it downloaded, so I don't need to actually do that. But once you have it downloaded and you've opened it, this is basically what a GeoGebra file looks like. This is kind of the finished or close to finished version of the applet that we're going to use. There are instructions on the last page of Lab 1 that will basically go through the steps to create this. I'm going to also go through the steps to create this in the context of explaining how to just introduce GeoGebra, but this is basically what your finished product will kind of look like. There's a few more things that I'll ask you to do in the lab, but this is basically it. This is called a slider. So what I've done here is I basically have these rectangles represent the midpoint rule. That's what I have highlighted right now. So notice that the rectangles intersect the curve at the midpoint of the interval, right? So halfway between the two endpoints. And right now I'm using 10 rectangles. The slider allows me to change the number of rectangles, so I can go down to 1, I can go more. So first, we'll look at how to graph the function, then how to create the slider, and then how to create both the midpoint and the trapezoid rule. So I'll also point that out. So I can, just by clicking this, I can see it or kind of turn it off without deleting it. We're also going to create a trapezoid rule. So these, it's a little bit harder to see there, but you can see, like, for 1 or for 2, these are using trapezoids to estimate the area underneath the curve, right? So, and the more trapezoids we put in there, the better it seems to approximate the curve, right? We'd have to really zoom in to kind of see the difference between the area of the trapezoid and the area underneath that part of the curve at that point. Okay, so this is just so you can kind of get a sense for what the finished product is going to look like. So I'm going to click here, and I want to, under File, I'm going to start over with a fresh file because that's what you'll be using. So, we could also open something that we'd saved. We could save something that we've created. You can share it, download it, or you can look at what, if you wanted to print it, what the print preview would be. Right now, I want to create a new file. So what this is doing is asking me what I want to do with the file that I already had open. So it could be useful for you to save the file. So if you wanted to save it, then you would name it here and you would click Save. I don't want to save, I want to start over from scratch. So I'm going to click Don't Save, and now this gives me my new file, kind of my fresh GeoGebra file here. Notice that in the default, they have this keyboard down here, which I think is, so obviously if you're on a laptop or a desktop, you can just use the keyboard that you have. If you're on a device without a keyboard, then this could be useful. I can get rid of it. Notice the icon is down here. I could always bring it back, but I'm not going to use it. I'm going to use the keyboard on my laptop, so I'm going to get rid of that. So the first thing we're going to want to do, well, I guess before I get into actually creating it, let me just show you a few other things. So this is your one of your main tool menus. So we looked at File, Edit allows you to undo and redo, but you can also do that with these buttons up here. You could copy and paste. So those are the things you can do under Edit. Oh, I guess there was also Options. So this allows you to basically, this is looking at your axes, right? So you can designate your X and your Y axis. You can put a grid on if you want. So going back here, if I close the edit menu, math apps, graphing calculator, that's what we're looking at right now. The graphing calculator is basically this input bar and this graphic space as well as the keyboard. CAS would look a little bit different. CAS stands for Computer Algebra System, which we won't really use in this class. There's also something just for geometry, which is basically a blank space, so it doesn't have the input bar. You would create things directly using these tools. Anyways, there's a number of things here. We'll mostly use the graphing calculator, so that's what I'm going to focus on. And now notice if I click graphing calculator, also I'm just going to center this, I get this grid, which I could turn on or off under edit. If I didn't want a grid, I could turn that off. So you can show grid or not show grid right there. I'm not going to worry about showing the grid right now. A couple other things. So that's under math. That's under edit. That was math apps. Views. The algebra view is basically this input area over here because it'll show you basically the equations that we're graphing. And then the graphics view is this right here. I already mentioned about the CAS. You could have a second graphing window if you wanted to graph two different things. You could go 3D graphics, spreadsheet, etc. But again, we're mainly going to use this algebra view and the graphics view. Under options, you have a few things here. You can edit labels, you can change the font size, the language, the rounding. Tools we won't really use. Help you may use if you have a question about how to do something that's not covered in this video, then you could use the help menu. Here you have other options too. These are all drop downs. So you can put a point on, you can find intersection or a midpoint, you can create lines, you can create perpendicular or parallel lines, you can create polygons, circles or arcs, ellipses, hyperbolas, you can measure angles or distance, area, measure slope. These are different transformations you could do in terms of reflections or translations or dilations. This is kind of a hodgepodge, but we will use the slider one today. And this is the different things you could, ways that you can, like if I wanted to move, you've already probably saw me do that once, I can move this around, or I can move just one axis, right? So this is something we'll use quite a bit. Probably the biggest thing to get, or the hardest thing to get used to with GeoGebra is if you want to do anything, if you want to drag anything or click on anything, you need to be with the arrow here. Otherwise, you're actually using one of these tools. If I'm clicked on this and I try to click on an object here, then all it's going to do is move the window. It's not going to actually click on the object. So you kind of always want to come back to your arrow. Okay, so that's just kind of an overview of what you get with GeoGebra. So let's start with graphing. We want to graph the function e to the negative x, and I'm just using the caret here to get x in the exponent. First I needed to get x in the exponent, and then I need to get 2 in the exponent. And then I'm just going to hit enter. And notice when I hit enter, it assigns it f. So if you want to input this, I think it's easiest just to go ahead and type in your function, and it will assign it f. If I were to do another one, it would probably assign it g. And it also gives it a color to just contrast it with everything else going on in the graphics window. So I'm going to use this now and try to get a better view here. This is kind of small. I want to be able to really focus in on this area, because what we want to try to do is in this lab is we're going to estimate the area from -1 to 1. So I can, if you notice I have a little arrow here, I can adjust one axis. I can adjust them independently, or I can use my touchpad to just scroll, and that will kind of bring them together in and out at the same rate. Okay, so I've got that. Now we're going to Well, one of the first things it asks you to do is find the exact area. And to do that, we can write actual equals, so this will be the actual area underneath the curve. And we just type in integral. And one thing that's nice about GeoGebra is it'll give you some options. And this is probably the easiest way to do this. I want to integrate, and I'm going to have a start value -1 and end value 1. Actually, this is the one I want right here. So if I click this, then it highlights. I can also, if you want to see more here, I can pull this out. Just so I'll show, I can put it back, but I can just type in F to right over that. That's where the function goes. So I'm just going to type F. Oh, come on. All right. Now it's not going to behave. Of course, F. And then if I just right-click over, it's going to make me do all of them. All right. So we're going -1, comma, and then my x value is going to be +1. All right, so that's the actual area, 1.49, and I'm just going to hit enter. All right, I'm going to move this back so I can see my graph a little bit better. Now I want to create, so that's the actual area. I don't want to look at that right now. We'll use that to compare with our approximations. I need to create a slider. So actually what I'm going to do to create the slider is I'm going to go, that's the slider button, click on slider, and then just click into the area, and it brings up this menu here. And we want to name our slider N, and then we're going to make our slider go from 1 up to 20 by increments of 1. All right, and probably don't know even what that means yet, but it means we're going to start at 1, and again, if we go to the move tool, it starts at 1, it's going to go up to 20, and it's going to go by increments of 1. All right, and this is going to control the number of rectangles or trapezoids that we have. Okay, so now that I have the slider, I need to create the slider first because now I want to create my midpoint approximation. Midpoint equals, and I'm going to use the command rectangle sum. All right, so this, I'm going to put function, the start value, the end value, the number of rectangles I want, which is going to be n, so I can just use the slider to control that, and then the position of the rectangle. So if I wanted to use a left-hand approximation, I would put in 0. If I wanted to use a right-hand approximation, I would use 1. And since I want to use the midpoint approximation, the position for the rectangle start will be 0.5, which is right in the middle. So I'm going to select that, and then I'm going to have F start at -1, go to 1. My number of rectangles is n, and then I'm going to put in 0.5 for the position of the rectangle, and I hit enter. So here's my midpoint rule. And again, because I put in n for the number of rectangles, I mean, I could put in a number, but then I'd have to double click and change it every time. So it's a whole lot easier just to use the slider to change the number of rectangles. Okay, so there's my midpoint. The next one I want to create is my trapezoid rule. So I can type in trapezoid equals, and this is just giving it a name. So this one's going to be called midpoint, this one's going to be called trapezoid, just to make them easy to remember. Then I put in the command. So if I start to type in trapezoid, I get this trapezoidal sum. So again, similar to the rectangle sum, I put in my function, start value, end value, and number of rectangles. So I'm going to select that, F, -1, 1, and then n, and I hit enter. Okay. Now, the other thing you might notice, let me get rid of this down here and zoom in a little bit. Move this down. They're kind of over top of each other. So again, as I pointed out at the beginning, you can just click, let me go to my move tool. If I click on this, then I won't see the trapezoid anymore. Now I just have the midpoint. And in fact, I'm also going to just take this label and move it down so it's a little bit easier to see. So there's midpoint. And then if I click on midpoint, that goes away, and I can click on trapezoid so I can see the trapezoid. And I'll do the same thing with the trapezoid. I'll just move it down here. Okay, so that pretty much is it. There's a few other things you'll need to do by finding the error, which will be the difference, obviously, between the actual and the midpoint, would be the error of the midpoint, and the difference between the actual and the trapezoid would be the error for the trapezoidal. One thing, though, you notice right now, it looks like the trapezoid is pretty exact, right? This is 1.49, this is 1.49. But that's because it's rounding. So let's go over, and I'll just remind you, one thing you'll need to do is to change the rounding in this. So under options, we go to rounding and we can choose, and I think 5 decimal places will show us that they're not exactly the same, right? So there is some error with the trapezoidal rule. And actually the midpoint is maybe closer than it looked at first because it's 14951, not 1.5. It just rounded it to 1.5. Anyways, so that's an important tool. We can just click on this to make that go back. To be able to change the rounding so that you can actually see what the error is. So the other thing you'll do in the lab is you'll create Simpson's rule with a weighted average of the midpoint and trapezoid rule. But now that you have midpoint and trapezoid created, that's just a simple input command. This is the main part that I wanted to demonstrate so you could see how to use GeoGebra.